When people imagine retirement, they usually worry about one big question. Will I have enough? Enough savings? Enough income? Enough security? For decades, that question drives almost every financial decision people make. You're saving, you're investing, you're paying off debt, you're trying to prepare for the day when the paychecks finally stop. But after talking with many retirees over the years, I've noticed something interesting. Once retirement actually arrives, the biggest challenge usually isn't the math, it's the adjustment. Because living on less money in retirement, it isn't just a financial challenge, it's a mental shift, really. And sometimes that shift takes a little time to feel comfortable. Today I want to talk about the hidden challenge of living on less in retirement and why for many people it takes a while before it finally starts to feel normal. First, let's talk about the moment the paycheck disappears. For most of your life, money flows in one direction. You work, you get paid, and that cycle repeats itself for 30, sometimes 40 years. The paycheck becomes part of the rhythm of your life. Even if you're careful with money, even if you're a good saver, there's always another paycheck coming. But retirement changes that rhythm almost overnight. Suddenly, the income you once earned from work is replaced by something different. Social Security, savings, pensions for some people. And even if the numbers work perfectly on paper, and it can still feel very different because the money isn't coming from work anymore. It's coming from the life that you actually built. And that can create a strange feeling for many retirees. Almost like you're spending the life you already built instead of spending a paycheck. But folks, that's only the first adjustment. The second change is much quieter. And most people don't even notice it happening at first. Now, I call this the permission problem. You spend decades learning how to save money. You learn to delay purchases, avoid waste, put money aside for later. Saving becomes just a habit. And for many people, it even becomes part of their identity. They're the responsible one. They're the careful one. They're the planner. But when retirement begins, something unusual happens. For the first time in decades, you're supposed to do the opposite. Instead of saving for the future, you're supposed to live on the money you saved. And on paper, that sounds simple enough, but emotionally it can take time because habits built over 40 years, they don't disappear overnight. Many retirees find themselves hesitating before spending money, even when they can afford it. Not because they're struggling, but because their mind still thinks like a saver. One old guy told me something, I'll never forget this. He said, I spent 40 years of my life learning how to save money. And now, retirement expects me to suddenly learn how to spend it. Folks, that sentence captures something a lot of retirees feel, but they rarely talk about. It's not fear, it's just unfamiliar. But after that adjustment begins, another quiet change starts to happen. I like to call these the quiet lifestyle adjustments. They aren't dramatic sacrifices. Most of the time, they're just small shifts in how life works. You might wait a little longer before replacing something. You might think twice about purchases that once felt automatic. Maybe you cook more meals at home. Maybe you become a little more thoughtful about spending. But here's what many retirees, they actually eventually discover. They don't actually miss much because once the structure of working life disappears, a lot of the spending tied to that life disappears also. There's no commuting. There's less convenient spending. There's fewer rushed purchases because there simply wasn't time to think about them. You just made the buy. Life slows down and spending often becomes more intentional. But underneath all this, there's an even deeper shift. And it's taking place right now. And it has to do less with money and more with your identity. During your working years, your financial life focused on one thing, building your savings, building your investments, building your security. Every year, the goal is to move forward, to grow the pile. But retirement flips that picture around. Now the goal isn't to build, it's to manage, to protect what you've built, to stretch it across the years ahead. And that shift can feel strange at first. After decades of accumulation, you're now slowly drawing from the very thing you spent years creating. And for some people, that transition feels very uncomfortable. Not because the plan isn't sound, but because it's simply different from everything they've always known. But here's the part many retirees, they eventually discover. After the adjustment period, something changes. The anxiety fades, spending habits settle, and life begins to feel normal again. Many retirees start to realize something they didn't fully understand before. They don't actually need as much as they once thought. When the noise of working life fades, when the pressure to keep up disappears, life often becomes simpler. The focus shifts from earning and accumulating to just enjoying ordinary days. It could be a quiet morning, a conversation with a friend, even a walk around the neighborhood for that matter. The kinds of moments that never show up in a retirement calculator, that's for sure. But they end up mattering the most. One of the biggest myths about retirement is living on less automatically means living worse. But many retirees discover just the opposite. Living on less often leads to living more intentionally. Spending becomes more deliberate. Experiences matter more than things. And over time, the idea of having enough becomes clearer. Because enough isn't just a number, folks. It's a feeling, a sense that your life is steady, it's predictable, and it's manageable. And once that feeling arrives, many retirees realize something surprising. They're not really giving anything up. They're simply living differently. So the challenge of living on less in retirement isn't really about math. Most of the time, the numbers have already been planned. The real challenge is learning how to think about money in a completely new way. After decades of earning, savings, and building, retirement asks you to shift into a different routine. And like any major life transition, that rhythm, it takes a while. It takes time to settle. But once it does, many retirees discover something they didn't expect. Life becomes quieter, becomes simpler. Often it becomes a lot easier, and sometimes more satisfying than they imagined. Because sometimes the biggest realization in retirement is this: you spent your whole life preparing for financial security, only to discover that what you really wanted was peace of mind. Folks, if this was helpful, please make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss the next one. Here we're building a community of like-minded people who are figuring out what retirement actually looks like. Not the glossy version, just the real one. I appreciate you spending some of your day with me here today. Folks, you all stay steady, and I'll see you in the next one.